Thank you so much for joining, everyone. I'm thrilled to be back with our Move and Connect webinar series. I'm the Executive Director of the Active Aging Society, Sarah Lucina, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all here today. As a step towards reconciliation with First Peoples of what is now colonially known as Canada, I acknowledge that I'm joining this webinar from the unceded and ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, and we have folks from all over BC joining us today. So feel free to pop in the chat the name of the land that you're joining from, and you can learn more about the traditional territories of Indigenous people globally at nativeland.ca. That should come up in the chat momentarily. It's an interactive map and a great way to see the traditional territories of First Peoples across the globe. And I also invite you to learn more about the 94 calls to action put forward in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, and that website will come up in the chat momentarily as well. And in your personal and professional lives, please consider the ways that you can work towards those calls to action and in meaningful and bold ways. Calls 18 to 24 are focused on health, and I consider these calls and the activities of the society and my day-to-day professional work. So as you know, the Active Aging Society promotes seniors' physical, social, and mental health in British Columbia and beyond. And it's our vision that older adults are supported to live active, connected lives. And I just want to acknowledge the Society's funders, including the BC Ministry of Health and the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. Many of you who are joining our webinar today have been a part of our signature program, Choose to Move. And if you've not yet participated in Choose to Move, or you want to refer it or refer somebody into that health promotion program, hop on our Choose to Move website. That'll come up in the chat as well. We have new programs offered in locations across BC, more and more in the months ahead. So hop on that website to see how you can get involved or refer somebody else in. And on that Choose to Move website, you can subscribe to our newsletter if you're not already on our newsletter, and you can access our Get Active resources that can help you get active and stay healthy right now. And really useful tools to build more physical and social activity into your daily lives. Okay, so some housekeeping before we launch into the presentations today. Many of you will have sent in some questions when you registered. Thank you for doing that. If you have questions throughout the presentations, feel free to just pop those into the chat as you did before. If you've joined us before, and we'll have about 40 minutes of presentation before we move into that interactive question and answer period. Many of you might not be familiar with Zoom, so if you need to, you can message directly the Active Aging Society if you're having any kind of technical difficulties throughout the presentations and our webinar today. Closed captioning will be activated, so if you want to deactivate it, just click on the button on the right side of the lower Zoom panel function. And as you might have heard when you joined, this webinar is being recorded, and this webinar will be up on our website for future viewing. Nobody who is joining today, if you're not a presenter, we can't see your video function or your name, and that won't be recorded. So without further ado, our presenters and our topic for today. I'm so thrilled to have two incredible leaders in community development and emergency preparedness take us through some of the health and safety issues that we should consider in our preparation for emergency events. Emergency preparedness is undeniably a health topic, and for decades we've been hearing the warnings of climate change, and increasingly we're seeing the human toll it is taking. Heat domes, tornadoes, floods, landslides all pose a unique risk to our health, and we know that these climate and emergency events don't impact all communities and all people equally. There are many different vulnerable groups that need to be considered, including older adults. Older adults are a disproportionate risk in these emergency events. So we're going to think about that today in our presentations. But health and well-being can be optimized and protected if we prepare ahead of time. And, and we'll learn about how we can move towards those preparations. So welcome, Katja and Stacey. Katja Tainan is the Manager of Resilience and Disaster Risk Reduction with the City of Vancouver, and Stacey Barter is the Executive Director of the Building Resilient Neighborhood and a lead with the Hey Neighbor Collective. I'm thrilled you're both here. Stacey, you're going to kick us off, so I'll hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm really so excited to be here and so grateful to have the invitation. So as Sarah said, I'm Stacey Barter. I'm joining today from my home office, which is in the traditional unceded territory of the Lekwungen speaking people, also known as Victoria, BC. And I'm just going to pull up my slides to get started and make sure they are working. Just give me 2 seconds here. Great. And maybe I'll just ask Katja to give me the thumbs up if you can see that. Yes, okay, great. Great, so as I said, I work with Building Resilient Neighborhoods, which is a small nonprofit organization based in Victoria, but we do work across BC, and I get to collaborate with great folks like Katja. As we have been rolling out this program we started in Victoria several years ago called Connect and Prepare, and we've been really privileged to be partnering with other communities, including the City of Vancouver, City of New Westminster, and the City of North Vancouver to bring the program there this year. And we've been doing this work through a partnership with the Hey Neighbor Collective, which is a collective of many organizations who are really focused on how to build stronger social connections and resilience in multi-unit housing. So that's been a big focus of our work. And what I wanted to share today is really some of what we've been learning through this work that we're all doing together about how we can be better prepared for emergencies and really strengthen our shared resilience by having very strong neighbor-to-neighbor connections. So that's kind of the theme of what I wanted to share. So what we've been learning and experimenting with in our community development work is how strong neighbor-to-neighbor connections really are foundational for being prepared for emergencies. And if we can build a culture where we live of neighbors helping neighbors, if we have those strong kind of neighborly relationships, we find that communities are more resilient and able to respond better to different types of emergencies and stresses that come our way. So why do we think it's so important to focus in on social connections in order to be prepared? Well, Sarah already kicked us off with this. I think we're all really witnessing the number of stresses and different kinds of extreme events that are coming our way. Just before we started today, Katja and Sarah and I were talking about just the last few days, the heat that's been here and the concern we all have about that. And looking back at on the heat dome of 2021, the number of deaths that we experienced with that. And it's not just that, all kinds of climate events that are really much more present. And I think we're all much more aware of that. So we're finding more and more people are concerned about being prepared as we see these kind of big events coming our way, the floods in the Fraser Valley, wildfire smoke becoming much more common. And so we've been wanting to focus in on how we can be better prepared as communities for these big events, but also not just these big events. The question we've been sitting with is how can we get prepared together, but also strengthen our resilience for things that what we would call like everyday emergencies or these chronic stresses that many of us experience, from everyday health emergencies to some of the pressures we feel around climate change. So traditional emergency preparedness, and hopefully Katja will speak to this and maybe affirm this. What I've seen is that traditional emergency preparedness tends to focus on those big events. We want to be prepared for the earthquake or the big heat wave. And that is very, very important. It tends to focus on getting prepared individually or in our own households. And that is absolutely critical. We all need to do what we can to be prepared at that level. But what we found is that it's not enough. Being prepared individually and just focusing on those big events doesn't necessarily prepare us or equip us with some of the most important foundations for emergency preparedness, which a lot of research is showing what really makes a difference is strong social networks. So Katya's seen me share this slide before. This is an image from the 2011 earthquake and tsunami in Japan. And there was a researcher from Northeastern University in the United States that looked at communities in Japan and how they responded on the heels of this emergency and which communities fared better in their recovery efforts. And what they found was it wasn't actually the emergency supplies, the bottled water and the batteries and all those things we tend to focus on when we talk about emergency preparedness, which of course are important. But what they found really made a difference was that the communities that had strong social networks, people were connected with their neighbors, they had connected, strong communities, they fared better than others. And so this has really sort of become our key message with Connect and Prepare, is that it's these social connections that make a difference. And the title of this blog article, which you can see on the screen, was Social Ties, Not Just Sandbags. So we need the sandbags for floods, but even more than that, we need to invest in our social ties. And so it's this idea that it's not just what's in our kit, but also who is in our kit. And when we think about that, in the event of emergencies, it's often our neighbors who are our first responders, those who are right next door. And so we put a lot of emphasis on really strengthening those relationships with those who are right next door and being well connected in our neighborhoods to neighborhood-based organizations as well. I wasn't even thinking about this when I put this slide in, but of course, this is the Active Aging Society and the Choose to Move program. So maybe it's apropos that we often talk about this idea of resilience muscles, and that if we invest now in strengthening up these social connections, they will serve us to be strong when big events happen. And what we found from the communities that we've studied is that the communities that have are more resilient tend to have very strong connections to place, to their neighborhoods, that people feel like they can help each other out, and that there's a welcoming of diverse neighbors. So we always emphasize that. So again, just kind of circling back, what we're interested in is how do we make sure we're really well prepared, but that through our preparedness efforts, we're building connections. Instead of just doing it on our own, we're doing it together, and that by building strong relationships, we're resilient for the long haul, not just in those emergency moments. And yet, I often say this is sort of the pinch point. We know that these social connections and networks are more important than ever, but the reality is, as a society, we're experiencing more loneliness and isolation than we have ever. I think many of you probably heard the US Surgeon General just put out the report about the loneliness epidemic they've declared there. And we're I think on the heels of the pandemic, we're all the more aware of how isolation and loneliness has a really detrimental impact on us. So we know it's a really critical issue, and yet it is one of the most important opportunities to become more resilient by strengthening our connections. And we also know that stronger social connections not only will help us be more prepared for emergencies, but also it's so beneficial for our health. So some of you may have heard the I think it was a landmark study that said if you're socially isolated, the impacts on your health can be as detrimental as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Conversely, for those who are well connected, it's got all kinds of positive health benefits. So we like to think of this as sort of win-win. Can we build up these strong social connections, these connections with our neighbors? It's going to benefit our health. It's also going to help us to be more prepared for emergencies, and also just happier. We have safer communities and happier communities when we're well connected. So I wanted to share a few ideas before I turn it over to Katya, who has much more to share, of Okay, it sounds great. Probably how do you get started? Some of you may already be connected to your neighbors, but for those who aren't or want to strengthen their connections more in order to start getting prepared for emergencies together rather than just individually. So I thought I'd share just a couple of examples that I've been inspired by from our Connect and Prepare work. The first is an example from Victoria, an apartment building that we worked with here. It's a Capital Regional Housing building that houses seniors with disabilities. And these folks first got engaged with us through our Resilient Streets work, and they got curious about this idea of building stronger connections with their neighbors. So what they started with was they started hosting tea time in their lobby just to get to know their neighbors. And through hosting regular tea time, they started talking about what are some of the things that matter to people, what was going on in people's lives. And they realized that as low-income seniors, many of them were struggling with basic food security. So a couple of the volunteers who are older adults themselves, they developed a partnership with a local food organization and started bringing in food distribution into the building so people could access healthy food because many people, because of mobility issues, couldn't get out of the building easily. So that was their first project. And they realized through that, you can see the quote here, I think that the significant mindset shift that happened through that was they said, wow, we tend to focus on our disabilities, but we realize we have all these abilities. And we learned so much through doing that work. So they wanted to continue with their kind of community building efforts and partnered with us to bring in the Connect and Prepare program. We did a series of workshops with neighbors on getting prepared together. And they together realized, you know what, we want and need emergency supplies. Many of us can't afford that ourselves, or we live in these small apartments and don't have room necessarily to store it. So they worked with us to develop a shared kit of emergency supplies, worked with the building manager to find a space in the building to store that. And then we supported them with an application for a neighborhood small grant to develop grab and go emergency kits for each of the residents that lived in the building. But instead of just handing out grab and go kits, they thought, you know, let's make this a celebration. Let's make this a community building opportunity. So they hosted what we would call a party with a purpose and brought neighbors together to build the kits together and do education on basic emergency preparedness. So that's just, I think, a lovely example of kind of a multi-pronged approach to neighbors getting together and building their connections and getting more prepared together. And any one of those, I think, would be a great start. This is another image from another community that we worked with in Victoria. This one is a little bit different because it was a block of single family residences. Grant Street in the Fernwood neighborhood in Victoria. They also got together and said, why do we all need all these individual emergency supplies? Yes, we need our basic kits, but can we get together and develop a shared kit and a plan? So they developed a whole block level plan for emergencies as a group of neighbors. Where would they gather? Where would their meeting point be? Setting up sharing of contact information. But in order to kind of keep that alive and current, they also invest in doing regular social gatherings so that they feel connected as neighbors. They have a book club, they do potlucks, and then at their annual block party, they review their emergency plan and make sure that it's up to date and everyone's contact is current. So that's a couple of examples. And I wanted to just suggest, for those of you who are thinking about, well, what is something I could do to get started, just leave you with a few ideas. I think this idea of buddying up is one of the most significant things that we can do. Finding someone, a neighbor nearby who can be a buddy or we can be a buddy for, and at a minimum, agreeing to be in contact and look out for each other in emergencies. And you could take it where you want to. You could leave it at that or actually support each other in other ways. I know some buddies have created systems where they help each other in other ways with rides or grocery shopping or things like that. So buddying up, I think, is a great first step. Anything you can do to get to know your neighbors, I think, is a great investment in sort of building up those muscles that then if we know our neighbors, we know who to look out for and they're going to look out for us as well. So things like potlucks or a party with a purpose or coffee or tea hour in the lobby, anything like that, although it may not feel like emergency preparedness, is actually serving us to be better prepared. And then a couple more ideas. What we've seen has made such a difference are groups of neighbors that have some kind of system for staying in touch, so some kind of communication system. We found when the pandemic hit that a lot of the communities that we had worked with in Connect and Prepare who had set up some kind of communication system, whether that was an email list or a simple bulletin board in the lobby, or a WhatsApp group if you're on social media, they were able to stay in touch. So when the pandemic hit, they were able to support each other a lot better and identify those neighbors who couldn't get out that maybe needed support because of health issues with grocery shopping. So a basic communication system can make a huge difference. And then the last idea I'll leave you with is just this idea of preparing together. So can you maybe reach out to your local emergency management department, have them come in and do a workshop. I know lots of neighbors now who are coming together to do heat plans together, or doing simple things like setting up a cool room to cool down in their building when heat events are happening. So a few tips I'll leave you with, some thoughts. We have lots of other ideas and some resources about things you can do to become more resilient and prepared together. So I'll share some of those resources. I think my colleague Anna is here and probably will put some of those in the chat. And just in terms of getting started, we've got some resources and ideas there, but I think starting with people you know is a great way to go, or just reaching out to neighbors, going door to door can also be a way to get started. So Anna will drop those into the chat for you, and I think they'll be shared out afterwards. And really happy to answer any questions, invite you to check out these resources, including a short video that we've done recently with Hey Neighbor Collective, and happy to chat more after Katya. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Really, really helpful to think about those everyday emergencies as well as those big events, and just that essential piece of being connected. Really helpful to think about that as a tool in the toolkit. Katya, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today and letting me share a little bit of the work that we're doing at the City of Vancouver. I also want to say thank you so much to Sarah for the invite. We've had the pleasure of working together for years now, and same with Stacey. She and I have been connecting on this work for years now, so it's really nice to be able to bring all of these folks together. So just give me a second while I share my screen. There we go. Stacey, can you give me a thumbs up? Awesome. Okay. So again, thanks everyone. My name is Katya Tynan. I'm from the City of Vancouver, and I'm here to chat a bit about some of the work that we're doing on resilient neighborhoods and communities. And so Stacey has set the stage by talking about how neighbors can get connected with neighbors, and sort of the ways that kind of grassroots kind of community efforts can build preparedness through social connection. And I'm going to kind of talk about a bit of a different layer around how nonprofit organizations and community-based organizations also have a key role to play in this work. Before I get started, though, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that I do this work on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And over several years, I think we at the city have been learning a lot about all of the ways that Indigenous communities on these lands have been living in sustainable, resilient, and adaptive ways for a millennia. And so we, in many ways, are actually playing catch up with them on how to kind of characterize this work on resilience, on how to kind of build community, and all of these other pieces that we're talking about today. Now, I always like starting with a bit of a definition of resilience, because I know that word actually means really different things to different people. And we also, I think, are seeing that word being used more and more in the media, more and more by different organizations. So from the city, the definition that we usually use is that it's our ability not just to survive, but also to adapt and thrive in the face of challenges and changes. So it's not really enough, or it's not really resilient if we're just continually being kind of hammered by all of these disruptions and issues, but we're not ever getting ahead of them. And then the other thing that I think is important to really emphasize is when we're talking about community resilience and sort of the grassroots side of it, it really is based on sort of three characteristics that I think many of us who work in community do very well, which is collaborative problem solving. So coming together, regardless of what the challenge is, to figure out solutions. Collective care, so the way that we care for each other, the way that we connect to each other, as Stacey just spoke about, and ultimately built at the speed of trust. So the way that we build trust, not just with between ourselves and our neighbors, but also between ourselves and organizations in our community, organizations and the city, etc. So this kind of idea of trust running through all of the work that we do. And then the second question that I always like to set in these conversations is resilient to what? And I think we've talked about this a little already, Sarah and Stacey spoke to this, but we sort of think of two categories in this realm. So one of those is acute shocks. We are thinking about things like heat waves, which is very pertinent for today. Wildfire smoke, pandemics, earthquakes, all these disruptions that we can and sometimes have faced in the past. But also underlying stresses. So these are the things that exist kind of in our community day to day and present challenges for us. So social isolation is actually a massive one. Ageism, racism, aging infrastructure, and the way our buildings and our infrastructure are no longer kind of serving the intended purposes that they have. And all of these factors that sort of make it more challenging for us to be resilient in the face of shocks. And then this other question that I think is really, really important for us to always start with is resilient for whom? So when we're talking about resilience, if it doesn't include kind of an equity lens, it's probably not going to get us very far in resilience. So people who experience day-to-day barriers and challenges in their lives, people who are kind of facing the brunt of those stresses, are ultimately going to have those exacerbated during emergencies and disasters. If you are someone or someone is food insecure day to day and there is an emergency or a disaster like a pandemic, that might actually increase the level of food insecurity that you're facing. So addressing those underlying inequities is really critical to this work. And I also, because this is kind of a health-focused group, health promotion-focused group, I want to also acknowledge that in many cases, the social determinants of health are actually pretty much the same as the social determinants of resilience. So the work that we do to build healthy, thriving communities from a health perspective also build healthy, thriving, resilient communities. And so we can actually do both of these things at once and have this serve multiple purposes. And then the other last thing I want to kind of recognize is if we want to kind of move to a more needs-based approach, again, recognizing not everybody experiences emergencies and disasters in the same way, a lot of what we need to do is really ask ourselves, like, who is impacted by these events and how, and what are the needs that we're not addressing? What are the kind of both day-to-day and emergency needs that we're not addressing? Now, the topic of the day is extreme heat. So I'm going to kind of turn our attention to that to just provide some examples of what this work has looked like in the context of heat. So we know that climate change is increasing the frequency and severity of extreme weather. We are and are going to continue seeing more and more extreme heat events. They're going to last longer and they're going to be hotter temperatures. In addition to that, the heat dome, which claimed the lives of over 600 people in the province in 2021, that exceeded our 2050 climate projections. So this is coming at us much faster, I think, than we might have anticipated. And then the third piece of this that I think is really important for those of us in BC is historically, at least in kind of the southern portions of the province, our climate is relatively mild. And so in most cases, our buildings are actually built to retain heat rather than release it in the summer. We don't, for the most part, have widespread use of air conditioning or mechanical cooling. So most of our buildings, even on kind of like a non-heat wave day, but a hot day in the summer, the temperatures indoors can actually be much higher than they are outside. So we need to think about that building temperature, not just how hot it is kind of in the weather forecast. Now, following the heat dome, the city did a lot of work to really understand kind of where the gaps in our programs and our services and our supports were around our heat planning. And the way we did this was we talked with and engaged with older adults and seniors, people with disabilities, and sort of a range of groups who were disproportionately impacted by that heat dome. And we asked a really basic question, which is, if another heat dome happened or another heat wave happened this year, what would you need to feel safe and supported? And what we got out of that was a huge range of recommendations and actions that were not the things that we were already doing, but in fact, much different actions that would directly support people who faced barriers in accessing the things that we had in place during the heat dome. So over the course of that engagement, we learned a lot about the ways in which we weren't meeting people's needs. We weren't kind of taking that equity approach, and that we needed to kind of address in our future planning. Another piece of this that I think we've learned a lot about in recent years is all of the ways in which nonprofits and community-based organizations have huge knowledge and capacity to offer in this work. They have deep relationships with all kinds of folks who are disproportionately impacted by emergencies, including older adults and seniors, including people with disabilities, including cultural communities who may face barriers to kind of having English or reading English language access to documents and preparedness information, all of these sort of barriers that existed. So we needed to work more closely with those partners. And then the third piece around this was also recognizing that the impacts in neighborhoods are actually different. So even within a city, within a town, there might be different impacts kind of across the geographic area. There are certain neighborhoods in our city where there's higher levels of what we'd call the urban heat island effect. So the sun is shining down and getting absorbed by paved surfaces and making it hotter than areas that have a lot more green space. There's also different assets and amenities in those neighborhoods. So some neighborhoods have a lot of kind of community centers, library spaces that people can kind of go to for help, and other ones have less. So we needed to really look at the different impacts that kind of existed across neighborhoods in the city. Now, on to the more interesting stuff. I think this is where really Stacey's and my conversations and work really connects. So we know, both based on the experiences that we've had here in Vancouver, the experiences in many communities all over the world, and a lot of academic research, that strong and flexible social fabric is the foundation of resilience. So people having strong social connection with their neighbors, organizations like nonprofits, kind of stepping into these spaces of kind of disaster resilience, all of those things factor into how resilient a community is. So we also know that during crisis, people go to the places they know and trust. That comes back to that trust thread again. As we're thinking of our work on emergency preparedness, on resilience, we need to sort of think of what are the organizations that are already rooted in community, that are building resilience day to day, that are addressing those social determinants, and then what is the role they might play in those emergencies, and how can we leverage the work that they do on social connection, on kind of a variety of community building services, and think about how those might need to transform during emergencies. And that brings us to a specific program we have at the City of Vancouver, which is called the Resilient Neighborhoods Program. So Stacey's work is really amazing at connecting neighbors to neighbors. And this layer from the city perspective is how we're working with community-based organizations on kind of a similar thing. The Resilient Neighborhoods Program is ultimately our way of building bridges between some usually pretty siloed pieces of work. So it's not enough for us to just think about emergency preparedness. We need to think about climate adaptation. We need to think about social connection. We need to think about health and equity, all of these things together that are interrelated. And we need to, again, work with community partners on how we build on the services and networks that they already have and think about how those might transform to meet emerging needs during emergencies. And so what that's looked like over the last few years for us with heat, last year we formed partnerships with 12 organizations across the city. These service agreements were with neighborhood houses, with the Friendship Center, with community services centers. And then we also partnered with organizations through a granting program. Those partnerships produced Sorry, I'm just going to get those to pop up. Produced a huge amount of work kind of beyond our wildest dreams and expectations at the city. So amongst our partners conducted wellness checks on over 1,200 older adults throughout last summer to make sure that they had the support and the connection they needed to sort of weather the proverbial storm around extreme heat. They distributed over 1,500 cool kits. So these are low tech, low barrier packages of supplies that can help cool people in their home in the absence of things like air conditioning. The city used our purchasing power to buy the supplies and deliver them to our partners, and our partners got them to the people who needed them most. Many of our partners then built their own cool kits because we didn't have enough to go around. Partners distributed over 1,000 fans and over 50 evaporative kind of air chillers and coolers. Many of our partners set up cool rooms with food and games and movies and other things to do to kind of have people not just have a cool space to go to, but be able to socialize and connect while they were there. In addition to that, one of our partners actually picked up Indigenous elders and brought them into nature spaces like lakes and rivers for land-based cooling. And many of our partners used their shuttle buses that they would normally use for older adult programming and kind of driving folks to and from services. They used those to pick people up and bring them to cool spaces, recognizing the gaps in transportation during those heat events in public transportation systems. So there was huge amount of work across the board amongst all our partners. Each organization did work that was kind of within their capacity, within the scope of the existing programming they run, and made sure they kind of made it their own. So they were working with their own staff and kind of viewing this work through the lens of their kind of day-to-day mission and figuring out how can we connect heat as an additional layer to that work. So a great example, I think, of this is many of our partners provide grocery hamper delivery. And so they were figuring out if we can deliver groceries to folks, we can also deliver cool kits, and we can use those for wellness checks too. So they're figuring out these kind of dual services throughout the summer. Now, essentially the last thing I want to impart in this conversation is I've spent a lot of time talking about heat, and I want to recognize that when we prepare for and build resilience to one challenge, we ultimately are preparing for and building resilience to multiple challenges. So as you can see from the slide, a lot of the things that we might think about doing for things like extreme heat in the summer actually have almost a direct translation to how we support community during, say, snowfall or extreme weather in the winter. Things like wellness checks, things like getting folks supplies that they need, social connection, all of these kind of activation of spaces for cooling and warming, all of those kind of draw from, and Stacey said this beautifully, this muscle memory that we need to develop in our communities. Some communities actually, I think, already have it, but more broadly, we need to kind of work on building that sort of muscle memory for resilience in and amongst ourselves. And there's many things that kind of cross-cut different kind of hazards or emergencies that we might face. So, you know, if you're thinking about getting started in this work, it's actually perfectly all right to start with a smaller emergency. I think where we've faltered or had challenges in the past is people go straight to the big stuff. And when we go straight to the big stuff, it becomes really overwhelming. So I encourage, if you're interested in kind of getting involved in this work, of thinking of what your organization can do, start with something that's a bit more manageable and try to tease out what your organization can do and would like to do, and then think of how that actually applies to different types of emergencies down the road. And then last but certainly not least, just a couple of resources I encourage you to check out. Prepared BC has a range of guides that are available for use, including ones for organizations, businesses, condos and stratas, all these different groups. So please check their page out for a lot of great resources. And then also plugging our own work, the Resilient Neighborhoods Toolkit that we developed in partnership with a number of nonprofits and community organizations. This toolkit has guidance for organizations that are looking to kind of do more of this planning work. And yeah, thank you so much to everybody for hearing me out, and I look forward to the discussion.
Wonderful, Katja. Thank you so much for that overview. I saw a number of questions pop up in the chat. People are keen to understand how they can get similar resources and supports happening in their community. And something that I failed to mention at the very beginning, at the opening, is that many of the folks who join our webinar, our webinars, are seniors themselves who participated in Choose to Move or just interested in keeping active and connected. But many are also senior serving organizations, like those that you spoke of, Katja and Stacy, neighborhood houses, senior centers, other community service organizations. So it's really important to think about those multiple levels and how they work together. And I really appreciate, again, like, this came up in Stacy's presentation, that building on strengths. What are you already doing as an organization? How can you build on that and connect it to emergency preparedness planning? And I think, you don't have to reinvent a new wheel. You can work with the one that you've got. So that's really, really helpful. So we're going to spend maybe 10-15 minutes going through a few questions that came in with the registration, as well as some questions that came in on the chat. If anybody has additional questions, feel free to just pop them in the chat. I'm going to monitor that. But Katja, maybe we can just start off with you with a question that just recently came in. Diane's wondering, how can Qualicum Beach community get some of these great resources, or how can smaller communities that are not the innovative city of Vancouver leading the way, how can they gain inspiration from what Vancouver is doing? What would you suggest to Diane to bring some of what you spoke of to her community?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, I mean, I can only speak for the city of Vancouver, but I will say, we often actually learn from smaller communities. I think what we've seen in British Columbia in the last several years around wildfires and flooding and landslides is, many more rural and smaller communities, not that Qualicum is rural, but many smaller communities have really been kind of facing the direct experiences that in Vancouver we're sometimes very protected from. And I think through those experiences, there are a lot of communities that are really leading this work in ways that we as the city of Vancouver, as a kind of larger group, are learning from and kind of training our eyes to how things are unfolding in those other areas. In terms of sort of transposing this type of a model, I would really encourage you to connect in with the staff at your municipal organization and feel free to share with them this presentation, to share with them, the Resilient Neighborhoods Toolkit, these sorts of approaches. And certainly also, I would encourage you to connect in with local nonprofits and organizations, because I think where much of this work really shifted for us was connecting with those organizations and realizing they were already doing so much in this space. It just wasn't being acknowledged very well. And so we've been trying to really make sure that we're acknowledging that that sector has also been, like, they are the innovators, they are leading the way. And so we're kind of trying to play catch up and support them in the ways that we can as municipal government. So yeah, definitely feel free to share those resources, the toolkit, anything else that's on our website, you're welcome to share. And then I'd also encourage you to connect in with your local health authority. We've worked a lot with Vancouver Coastal Health on extreme heat. They have produced some incredible guides, and I think they're coming out in the near future actually with a guide for municipalities to do extreme heat planning as well. So totally connect in with your health authority and your local government on that.
Yeah, and actually just on that focus on health, I don't have the city or the Vancouver Coastal Health Authority resources that you mentioned, Katja, but I can look those up for including into the resources. But I am including these two other links from the Government of Canada as well as the Government of BC. So some resources to support you in understanding the health implications of climate change and how to prepare, including smoke and heat events, and specifically for BC, how to manage your health in extreme heat. So that's really, what we're all interested in is keeping healthy and safe you know, individually and then collectively as a community. And just to kind of build on what you had mentioned there, Katya, around inquiring with your municipality, your district, about what they're already doing, because often they're doing a lot. We might just not know. And you know, in my position, I can say, like, write your elected officials if, you know, if you find out that maybe there's more there's opportunity to do more. We're all residents of different communities. We can highlight our priorities as residents, and it often, you know, that effort can build momentum for interest that's already there. So so that's another step that you can do as individuals on the call. Stacey, you talked about, you know, flexing that muscle, and like, you know, and you talked a lot about the loneliness epidemic. And, you know, from your experience, like, how have you seen, like, in the communities that you've worked with, you know, shifts in that experience of loneliness or isolation? Could you comment on, you know, how individuals in those programs were maybe connecting in a way that they weren't before, or how this focus on preparedness kind of built, you know, a different kind of energy amongst those individuals?
Well, Sarah, I can't remember if I said this to you before, but I often joke that what I like about Connect and Prepare and that language is that there's kind of two different pathways for people to engage. So some people really like to engage because they want to build social connections, and that is what motivates them to step forward. They may or may not be as concerned about emergency preparedness, but through the process of participating in the program, connecting with neighbors, and they also get the benefit of becoming more prepared. But for other folks, actually the focus on emergency preparedness is what motivates them to connect with their neighbors, whereas otherwise they might not be as motivated to do that. So I've seen that having these two pathways draws different folks in, but ultimately the benefits are the same, that everyone's getting more connected and prepared. But in terms of your question about, you know, how have I seen shift? Absolutely. And sometimes, you know, honestly, I think we can all probably relate to this. Sometimes the shifts happen in such a small way, but they're so meaningful. Honestly, if one person connects with one other person and can count on that and rely on that is such a significant shift that wasn't there in place before. And I've seen countless examples of that, where neighbors who didn't know each other before or knew each other, you know, to say hi, but then making that next step of having built the relationship to actually become buddies for each other or to help each other out. That's the step that we like to see. And I can think of lots of examples of that. And then the other example that comes to mind that I shared earlier, that was really evident to me during COVID, I just think back to those early days of COVID where we all were reeling and trying to make sense of what was going on. And what I saw was that those communities who had established networks, they had the mechanisms then to respond, and it made such a difference. And it made a difference in very practical ways, like I said, grocery shopping for neighbors who couldn't get out of the house. But also, as time went on, you know, we all learned it wasn't just the moment. Like, we thought it was just going to be that moment, but that was the long haul, and having those mechanisms and relationships in place to support each other. And we all had to get really close to home at that point, right? And rely on people who were right next door. So yeah, just that people could draw on that and feel less lonely and less isolated, because I think all of us struggled with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, many on the call know that Choose to Move is about being physically active and socially connected, and the program focuses on building strength in both domains, you know, like Connect and Prepare. Some people are drawn because of the social elements of the program. Some people are really keen to get physically active and fit and learn how to take better care of their physical and mental health. So, you know, just recognizing that people are coming in looking for different things, and that you're kind of meeting them where they're at. I just also want to take this opportunity to highlight that there's emerging research that shows that being physically active when it is safe to do so, when the air quality is good and the heat's not too intense and the ice isn't out on the sidewalks, actually protects our health for those extreme weather events. So, you know, those incremental steps towards more physical activity, more social activity, because the social activity supports our physical health as well, can help build some individual resilience for those extreme events. But of course, doing that, you know, in a safe way, kind of recognizing our own physical capacities. I want to kind of come back to some of the infrastructure pieces, Katya, that you had highlighted. BC has, you know, a unique kind of setup in terms of our buildings, you know, not a lot of air conditioning units in place, retaining heat as a key feature in our buildings. What can individuals do to stay cool? Like, where are the resources to gain access to fans or air conditioning units? What can stratas do better? There were a bunch of questions that came in prior to the webinar around those topics. Could you comment or make a suggestion?
Yeah. So the answer to that question is really that we need, like, this is not just the city that has to do this work. This is every sector, every level of government. There is no part of this that is held by a single group. And so when the stuff that I'm presenting on today, it is one piece of the work that's being done by the city of Vancouver, and I am just speaking about the city of Vancouver. There is a tremendous amount of work that is happening in other levels of government. So you mentioned, you know, what can stratas do? You know, the relationship with stratas is held by the province, and there's also the Condo Homeowners Association, which I know also is probably a good starting place to see kind of what is in place for strata corporations. And one of the links in the Prepared BC guide that I've shared is also specifically for condos and apartments and folks who are living in those types of spaces. So there's also work happening at the City of Vancouver around addressing these systemic issues in our buildings and our infrastructure. So again, I'm just speaking to like a piece of this, but there is a lot of work around making sure that there's adaptations and work being done around mechanical cooling for people's homes. There is a lot of work being done to update our building bylaws and our codes to make sure that buildings are safer and habitable for everybody year round. Lots and lots of work across the board. I also know the province had indicated that they were looking into mechanical cooling or air conditioning as a medical device. So lots and lots of work across different scales. And I encourage folks, you know, if there's a particular piece you're interested in, whether it's connecting with your strata or something like that, to check out those guides and then follow up with the groups that are kind of most able to influence change with those particular groups. The work that I do is specifically on kind of community serving spaces and nonprofits in this work. So yeah, all of that to say, like, lots of different actors who are kind of all involved in this work. Health authorities also have a role to play in making sure that you're connecting in with those kind of groups if you're looking at sort of interventions like cooling. In terms of like fans and things that are getting kind of distributed within community, our process is to kind of help procure those and distribute those through community-based organizations that are creating kind of neighborhood scale heat plans. So that's the way that we have approached this, recognizing those folks not only know who needs those items and those supports, but has, again, trust-based relationships with those folks as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Katya. So, and whether you're a senior serving organization or a senior yourself, you know, like Katya said, educating yourself, you know, through the resources that Katya shared in her presentation that will be sent by email to everybody. I saw a question in there, you know, where can I get these resources? Are they going to be shared later? They're going to come to your inbox before Friday. But just to educate yourself about what's available, and then to ask for more and to highlight your need, and you know, like you both presented on, like building on those strengths and networking those strengths together at the individual level and at the organizational level. Stacy, I saw
Yeah,
you.
let's
Oh,
jump
yeah.
in, if that's
Yeah.
okay. Just on the note of resources around heat and infrastructure, we'll share this in the resources that we're sharing out as well. But the Victoria Community Social Planning Council last year, in addition to, there's so many great resources that are coming out from health authorities, and Vancouver Coastal Health has really created some fantastic resources. But the Community Social Planning Council put together a resource that I thought was unique because it was specifically focused on what renters can do. And a lot of what I've seen tends to be focused on, adaptations people can make in their homes if they're homeowners, but as renters, we sometimes don't have as much control of our space. So that's a really great resource with really simple things that can be done if you happen to be a renter, and I'd be happy to share that in addition to some other resources.
Yes, please. We're going to have a thick resource list, which is great because it's a topic that spans many different domains and many different levels. So that's great. Stacy, I was going to just ask if you wanted to make any mention of that little chat that you had there, I think with Diane. Anything that you wanted to kind of highlight about those resources?
Oh, yeah. Do you mean with Debbie?
Oh, sorry. Was it Debbie? Yes. Sorry.
Yeah. Thanks, Debbie. Debbie was just asking about whether, well, it sounds like Debbie's interested in doing something with neighbors and like the idea of, the opportunity to build a shared emergency kit. And I was just saying, at this point, we don't offer Connect and Prepare in Surrey, but we're kind of actively hoping to be able to bring the program to other communities. So certainly open to exploring partnerships. We're happy to share some of the resources we have. If you just want to get going yourself with your neighbors, we can share ideas, and you're most welcome to reach out to us and send us an email, and we can share some thoughts on what we've seen other folks do and how they got started. And I also just added a link that Surrey does happen to have a neighborhood emergency preparedness program. So I shared that, and each emergency preparedness department municipally is a little bit different, but as you said earlier, not just with heat, they're great sources of information and to find out what's going on locally, so you can reach out to them.
Perfect. Thanks, Stacy. And I'm just throwing, sorry, on mute. I'm just throwing up here in the chat a link to Surrey's Age Friendly initiatives. They're doing some pretty advanced work in supporting seniors in their community. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left, and Wendy posted a comment and a question a little bit earlier in the chat, and she was, essentially looking to understand what kind of resources are out there around climate change education, and really interested in how to protect human lives through education. Wendy, I hope I'm paraphrasing here accurately.
I'm happy to jump in. It might not be directly answering your question, Wendy, but I've seen some really, really cool examples of where neighbor groups have come together to work on taking action around climate. So a lot of that has tended to be around, how can we learn together about what's going on with climate change, and then how can we take action around things like transportation or energy use. So the Transition Streets program is a really great model. There's a few other programs that are out there, but one of the things that I've really appreciated about the work that we've done with Connect and Prepare is it's sort of a forum to bring neighbors together to discover what they're interested in. And so to your point, the opportunity to look at how can we adapt to the changing climate and be more prepared, be more resilient, but also take action to be addressing some of the underlying causes and the roots of climate change. I think there's real opportunity there for neighbors, and there are some models, and neighbors can build on, whatever kind of gets you in the door and connecting, and then finding your shared passion. I think there's an opportunity to continue to work on some of those issues you're raising.
That's great. And I think Ketty and I just popped in a couple of other resources in the chat to support kind of climate literacy, climate change literacy. So they'll be included in the resource list as well. We are at time. That just, slipped away so quickly. Thank you for a hearty conversation, a super informative set of presentations. Stacy and Katya, so generous with your time and expertise. And thanks to everybody who joined today. It's going to, this webinar is going to be up and shareable on our website by the end of the week. And feel free to share it with colleagues and others, friends and neighbors who would be interested. And tell us your success stories. If you connect with your neighbors and have some neat ideas on how to kind of break the ice on preparing for chronic and those everyday emergencies, let us know. We want to hear about that. And join us in June 20th at 1 o'clock for our next webinar. Follow us on Facebook and our newsletter to register and receive the link. Thank you both. Have a great day, everyone, and see you again soon. Bye.